Forbidden Show of Mystery.
It's the Forbidden Show of Mystery.
Welcome to the new episode of the Forbidden Show of Mystery. I'm your host, Ben Craven. Okay, on to our regular segment, new music from old artists.
New music
from old artists.
I haven't really figured out what to say here, but the biggest release at the moment, the biggest news, the biggest buzz is the Beatles Get Back, Peter Jackson edit documentary on streaming at the moment. It is a fabulous watch. There are a lot of people, I believe, online complaining that, you know, maybe it's too long, maybe there's too much detail there, but it's the Beatles in the studio over 3 or 4 weeks making an album, you know, from scratch. It's just priceless. All of it, I don't care what anyone says. I found myself, as probably most musicians would, identifying with the band. Finding yourself in, or that person is like me, or So you find yourself in this documentary. You imagine yourself as one of the Beatles, deciding whether you want to move forward on a project, get an album done, get a show done, or just go home. By the end of the show, I am just so sad that it's all over. I'm reminded of many years ago when the anthology, remember those anthology TV specials when they came out? I think it was about the same time of year, right? It was November, December, something like that. It was leading towards the end of the year, and I felt the same sadness I did when they finished. Particularly poignant in this case because it's the last live performance ever of the Beatles, and they appear to leave it on such good terms that I think George Martin says, you know, this is just the beginning of what you could be doing. So it's just, it's heartbreaking. Also out this week was the Brian Wilson documentary, Long Promised Road. I'd say the timing was perfect. It is a completely different perspective, his situation versus, say, Get Back and the Beatles. Brian is one person trying to pull everything together. The Beatles had each other. Brian just seems to have had himself. And everyone's going to have their opinions on Beatles versus the Beach Boys and who they like better, and that's fine. Just in my case, the emotional undercurrent was in the Brian Wilson documentary. Hearing that music, just all the emotion is there. It's Beatles are great, and the Beach Boys are great too. Hang on. Bob. It's okay, it's just Bob.
Bob, the underappreciated audio engineer.
How's it going, mate? Yes, crossfades. I've got to talk to you about crossfades. Mate, the master has come back, and I notice all the songs are crossfaded. Now, this is great, but it's no good for streaming, right? People are going to play these tracks in any order, and you get a crossfade at the beginning. It's just going to make it sound weird. So I need you to remove all the crossfades. Yes, I know we haven't got the individual elements anymore. We haven't got the original mix, but mate, you can just fix that in mastering, right? Okay, thanks, mate. See ya. It's Bob. And now it is time for a studio update.
And now it's time for a studio update.
So my exciting news is that my new album, Monsters from the Id, the surround mixes are now completed. The surround mixes are now complete. Whatever. It's 24-bit, 96 kilohertz. The big question at the moment is what physical format this should come out on. So CD, obviously. People in this progressive rock format still like CDs, but the best way of putting out the surround mix, right? So regardless, there will be a digital release, a 5.1 FLAC release in 2496. So anyone with their surround setups will be able to download that and play it and hear it as it's intended. The question is how to present that on physical media. So, the obvious way to do this is to put out a Blu-ray. Personally, I haven't had a whole lot of success with Blu-rays and surround music. I mean, I still buy them, but in the past, say on a lot of the Pink Floyd box sets, those Blu-rays, the manufactured Blu-rays, have been prone to deteriorate over time and not work after a while. That scares me because it is, I know it is old technology, but it is relatively new technology compared with DVDs. You might remember I had a official bootleg release, I called it, the First Chance to Hear Blu-ray that I put out on Bandcamp. And that was the album launch, recorded, the live album launch performance of Last Chance to Hear. I had a lot of compatibility issues. Well, not a lot, 10%, I suppose. 10% compatibility issues with some players not playing this particularly authored Blu-ray. So that is weighing on my mind as well, as is just the number of people who still in the world do not own a Blu-ray player, which is shocking to me, but it just appears to be the case. On top of that, and this is something that would have to be passed on to the consumer, in the quotes I've got, it costs $2.50 more per manufactured unit to have a Blu-ray in it rather than DVD. Now, that is something that in the retail world would mark up to about a $5 difference to recover costs. So that is another significant thing that enters into this equation. What it overall means is I'm leaning more towards having a DVD, which does mean it's not a lossless surround version. However, it is DTS 9624, which sounds very, very good. Still retains the 24-bit information, 96 kilohertz. Yes, it's somewhat lossy, but it still sounds particularly good. It has a high bit rate, and it will allow anyone with a DVD player and speaker setup to play this and listen to it. You wouldn't need a Blu-ray player. You wouldn't need a DVD audio player. And the full lossless high-resolution downloads will still be available anyway. The videos will be on the DVD as well. It's kind of a compromise, and I may change my mind. So also this week, United Progressive Fraternity. They're a band, Mark Jurek, kind of an offshoot of Unitopia, Australian progressive rock band. Anyway, United Progressive Fraternity, UPF for short. A few years ago, Mark asked me if I had anything I wanted to contribute to an album that they were working on. I said, yeah, I've got something. So this was right at the end of my Last Chance to Hear sessions. I had an extra piece of music there that was in that same era, of that same feel, that same kind of instrumentation and approach. So I had a roughly completed instrumental track that I sent to them. Finally, I heard it the other day. There's words added to it. There's a vocal melody added to it. There's extra instruments. The drums have been replaced. Chewy came back to me to say, do you want to add any more to it? Do you want to add some more guitar to it? Anything you think that could help? I replaced the guitars on it. I added some acoustic guitars. So far, it sounds like $1 million. I think the project may be released soon. As soon as I know that for sure, I'll let you know. In my Patreon site, you can hear a snippet of the parts I recorded. Not the actual song. I don't want to release a song. It's not mine to release, but I felt okay putting some recordings of the actual parts I was playing. They're a bit out of context, but it's quite an interesting listen. And so the other interesting thing that's come out this week, I believe, is the new musical impro project. A few weeks ago, the guys from Frank and Fido, Tim Bennett's from 7 Day Mask, and Bennett's Craven, a work in progress. We all got together and actually played in the same room. We actually had not all played together before. And I was keen to get us all together and, do the old John Anderson trick and germinate the seeds and see what could happen. And we just played for, a few hours. Some really interesting improvised material came out of that, and that's inspired this new series called Extemporizers, which is at the moment a YouTube video intended series. We mix down a piece of music that's come out of those sessions, get together, have a chat about it, provide some commentary, some explanation, some apology. It's kind of a vehicle for presenting this improvised music, which is not complete, which is not finished, is still very valid and I think quite interesting and worthy of getting heard. Whether or not this music goes on to graduate to becoming a real finished release song in the future, I don't know. Whether we play with other people or different combinations, it's all exciting, up in the air, anything can happen. So Extemporizers episode 1, now out on YouTube. Look, before we go any further, a word from our sponsor, Ustreamify. Ustreamify. Now, you might have heard the news lately that one of the major competitors to Ustreamify has removed the shuffle option at the request of maybe the biggest recording artist in the world, who also happens to be on a major record label, which also happens to be one of the major shareholders of this particular streaming service. Well, our friends at Ustreamify are going one better. Not only are they going to remove the shuffle option, which means now you get to listen to the album in the order that the artist intended, Ustreamify is also removing the stop, skip, pause, repeat buttons, even the search functionality. So now you listen to exactly what Ustreamify tells you to. Ustreamify. Listen to what we tell you to and no one gets hurt. Ustreamify. All right, now we enter my favourite segment, Ask Dr. Ben.
Got questions? Need answers? Go ahead. Ask Dr. Ben.
So, Ben Crandall, no relation, writes, Dear Dr. Ben, I and many of your viewers, I'm sure, would be fascinated to know your approach for mixing in surround. The more excruciating technical detail, the better. Thank you, Ben. This letter couldn't come at a more opportune moment. Actually, semi-seriously for now, I've mixed a few surround projects in my life so far. There was Two False Idols in 2006, which was my first album. That actually came out as a DTS 5.1 CD. The Frankenfido single, Turn Out the Light, there was a surround mix of that done. I don't know if it was widely released, but it's quite good. And First Chance to Hear, that Blu-ray I was telling you about earlier, that had a 5.1 surround mix as well. And then, of course, the new album Monsters from the Id is also coming out as a 5.1 surround mix. So these are discrete 5.1 projects. I don't want to get bogged down in format discussion, but as a disclaimer, we should say that 5.1 as a method of delivery is quite different from the newer formats like Dolby Atmos, DTS:X, and even Ambisonics, which I believe the others were probably derived from. In these newer formats, the spatial information for each element or each object is essentially retained, and that's encoded in the stream. So later on, that can be processed to sound the best with whichever speaker configuration the listener has. Whereas, say, in 5.1 or good old quadraphonic, that spatial information is already baked into the discrete channel feed. The other formats, ambisonics, also have a vertical element, I believe, but overall, the intention is the same, and that's to give the listener a more immersive experience with the music, right? A producer or an engineer is going to choose how they want to present that information. For instance, do we want to replicate the sensation of watching a live show where the band's at the front, you've got the crowd around you and behind you, and the sound is kind of bouncing off the walls and you're hearing stuff echoing from behind and that sort of thing? That's one approach. We could also pretend that we are sitting with the band, perhaps in the middle of a circle, and the band's all around us, looking at us, performing together. That's another approach. These are all creative decisions that someone gets to make, and luckily for us, there's no real hard and fast rule yet, I believe, or expectations around how to mix music for surround, where you don't have that visual element to give you a frame of reference. So my approach has always been to use a surround mix to spread out the arrangement and make it easier to hear the individual parts. You might have noticed a lot of my music is very, very thick. There's a lot of instrumentation. A lot of it is difficult to make out the individual elements, even though it adds up to something quite substantial. So in a surround mix, I would generally start with the meat and potato parts, the rhythm section. So we're talking the bass and the drums generally up front, and work from there just to make all the other parts that get added in easier to differentiate and hear. For instance, your lead vocals go up the front, your backing vocals might go around you or at the back. So you've got that extra element there of surprise. Any instrument that is bass heavy would probably go towards the front, and your lighter area instruments towards the back. There's a few reasons for that. One is that most people would tend to have smaller, tinier speakers as the surround speakers, less bass response. So even though the sub is supposed to cover for that, it still isn't perfect. So, a big bass heavy sound coming from the back, it's probably not going to work so well because everyone has their better speakers at the front, which also brings me to the center speaker. So I understand that the center speaker was originally intended to reproduce sound that is supposed to emanate from the center of the room, okay? But regardless of where you're sitting. So if you're in a movie theater and you're sitting on the sides or you're sitting in a corner, you're still going to hear something like dialogue coming apparently from the center of the room. Literally a center speaker where the screen is, dialogue's going to come from that. No matter where you're sitting, you're going to be able to reference, oh, that's dialogue, it's coming from the middle, which is a great idea. But personally, I don't like this much for music, again, for a number of reasons. One, anyone with a surround sound setup at home, specifically for music, is probably going to make an effort to sit in the right place to hear a balanced view of things. On top of that, the standard consumer center speakers are generally smaller and cheaper and don't sound as good as the main left and right speakers. So things going through the center speaker are going to be limited in frequency response. So generally, I'd like to think that if a part is meant to be coming from the center, so again like a lead vocal or a bass guitar, it's still going to sound better through the main speakers, especially if you assume that the listener is seated in the correct position. So I do not tend to use the center speaker a whole lot in my mixes. I think on Two False Idols, I just blended a little bit of the lead vocal and the bass guitar into the center. But lately, with the amount I blend in, I find it's hardly worth it. If I'm starting with a really good stereo mix, a lot of the hard work and decision-making has already been done as to where each instrument is going to sit spatially in the mix. So for Monsters from the Id, the current mix, the current album, this was mainly a process of taking the different stereo elements and giving them an extra dimension along that front to back axis. Let me show you what I mean. When I was mixing Monsters from the Id, I went back to my original notes that I'd made for Two False Idols, and hang on, let's just kind of put that up there. You can see it's kind of a square, and that's meant to visualize the room, overhead version of the room. And I've kind of mapped out where I wanted each instrument to be on that plane from front to back. And then I started doing that for Monsters, and in the end, though, I just went to a classic spreadsheet. I'll show you what I used here, and it's probably quite self-explanatory. Well, there it is. The middle of the page is generally the center area down the center of the room. The top of the page are the front speakers and the bottom of the page are the rear speakers. This let me map out what I wanted to do, but also keep some consistency between the songs because, there's only 2 songs on this album, even though they're quite long. They are split up in different pieces, so I do need some consistency there. So as you could probably see there in Monsters from the Id, general approach is the same. The bass and drums are up the front. The lead vocals are up front. There's a lot of orchestra though, and a lot of orchestral-esque instrumentation going on. So these are kind of pushed back towards the rears so you can make them out and you can hear them. You know, you could argue that that's too much information to have in a stereo mix, and you shouldn't need a surround mix to make them out, but these parts add up to become something substantial in the stereo mix that would be otherwise missing. So the surround mix gives you a different perspective. Lets you hear more of the inner workings without, I don't know, compromising the art. Hello. It's all right, it's just Bob again. Yeah, Bob. Oh, mate, that's awesome. All right, no crossfades. Exactly what we wanted. So, look, I meant to tell you, Ustreamify's removed that shuffle option. So I'm still going to need a mix with the crossfades in it. Okay, look, how long is it going to take to reproduce the original work with the crossfades? No, mate, look, that's fine. That can come out of your budget. Oh, look, I'm also going to need some way of of your tracks, the music, to know whether the person's using the shuffle option or not. So if you can put some smarts in the metadata maybe, so it can figure out whether it's being shuffled or not, and then it will play the right version with the crossfades or not, that would be awesome. Thanks, Bob. You got this. That was Bob, the underappreciated audio engineer. All right, thank you for sticking around this long. Appreciate it. Shout out to all the wonderful people on Patreon who support this work. You can join there from as little as $1 a month US and unlock a lot of exclusive content. Patreon is a safe space for me, so I can put stuff up there that I wouldn't normally put up on YouTube. It's a trusted community. Thank you to Patreon people. Love you guys. So, until next time, this has been the Forbidden Show of Mystery. See you in a month.